Lumenvale is the kind of place that looks like most places at first glance. Market towns, river roads, working people going about the ordinary business of their lives. Look closer, and you start to notice things. The magic is quiet here. The darkness is quieter. And the people who matter most are rarely the ones with their names on any official seal. Breck is a courier. He carries things from one place to another across the roads of Lumenvale, and he asks very few questions, and he minds his own business. Mostly. He's 6.5 feet of farm-built muscle, and a decade of war compressed into something that passes for patience. And he has one rule that he's never quite managed to keep. Don't get involved. Dead Delivery is the first Breck story. It begins with a routine overnight job in a river town called Crestfall, but it doesn't stay routine for long. This is Chapter 1.
The road into Crestfall ran downhill for the last half-mile, and Breck always thought that told you something about a town before you ever set foot in it. Places built on rises watched the horizon. Places built in hollows watched each other. He came in from the north at midday, when the light was flat and colourless, and the rain had stopped but hadn't committed to staying stopped. The courier satchel rode his left hip, its strap diagonal across his chest. Before he'd crested the last ridge, he'd moved the faded cord bracelet from his pack to the strap. He'd been doing that for years without deciding to, the way a man will reach for a habit without naming it. And now it rested against the worn leather, pale as old straw, too small to be anything anyone would look twice at. He looked twice at everything else. Crestfall was a river town, one of a dozen that had grown up along the Calwick's eastern fork during the years when the trade routes were safe and merchants moved freely and magistrates were mostly honest. It had the bones of a prosperous place. Good stone buildings along the main road, a proper granary, a covered market square that could shelter 50 stalls in the rain. The bones were fine. It was the flesh that bothered him. The market square had 11 stalls where there should have been 30. The inn's signboard hung on one chain, the other rusted through. The board itself turned sideways, and no one had straightened it. A boy of maybe 12 sat on the step of a cooperage, with his elbows on his knees, and watched Breck come down the road with the particular, still-faced attention of a child who had learned that strangers were worth tracking before you relaxed around them. Breck noted it, kept walking. He had a sealed document for the magistrate's office, tax records from a landowner in the Northern Valley, routine work, the kind of job that paid badly and moved fast. He'd been told to deliver, collect a reply document, and be back on the North Road before dark. Clean work. No complications. The inn was called the River's Rest. He went in because he needed water for his flask, and because you learned more in 3 minutes inside a tavern than in an hour on the road outside one. The common room held perhaps a dozen people at midday, which was thin for a market town on a Thursday. A fire burned low in the far hearth. The smell was wood smoke, and old tallow candles, and something underneath that. A flatness, like air that had been breathed too many times without a window opened. A travelling entertainer had set himself up near the fire, the kind of hedge-mage who moved from town to town doing parlour work, small conjurings, coin tricks dressed in cantrip light, the sort of man who had enough real gift to be impressive and not enough to be dangerous. He was making a small flame dance between his fingers, blue at the base and orange at the tip, and the handful of children near him were watching with their mouths open. Breck got water from the bar, leaned against the wall, watched. "Here's the question," the hedge-mage said, letting the flame spiral upward into a brief column before snuffing it against his palm. He spread his hands wide, showman's instincts covering the wince. "If you could have one power, any power, the kind the old stories talk about, what would it be?" "Anyone." A boy near the front said, "Flight," immediately, with the certainty of a child who had thought about this often. A woman in the back called out healing. A merchant near the window, not looking up from his ale, said the power to know when a man was lying to him, and got a tired laugh from the table beside him. The mage went around the room. Strength, fire, sight through walls. The answers came quick and easy, the kind of question people had been sitting on their whole lives without anyone asking. He turned eventually to Breck. Breck was quiet for a moment. The mage held the silence, professional enough to know when waiting served him better than prompting. "I'd want to always be on time," Breck said. The mage blinked. It wasn't the answer the room expected. A few people glanced over, at the size of him, at the courier satchel, at the flatness in his voice that made it hard to tell if he was joking. "On time," the mage repeated. "For things that matter." He took a pull from his flask. Strength fades, fire goes out. Half the powers in the old stories come with a price nobody mentions until it's too late. He set the flask down on the bar. But if you could always arrive before something went wrong, before instead of after, that would be worth something. The mage held his gaze for a moment, then moved on to someone else. The room shifted back to its murmuring. The children turned back to the flame tricks. Breck pushed off the wall and paid for his water. The magistrate's office was on the north end of the square, a solid stone building with the town seal carved above the door and fresh mortar between two courses of stone near the corner. Recent work. More money spent here than anywhere else in Crestfall. He noted that too. A clerk took his delivery without looking at him, which was normal, and told him the reply document wouldn't be ready until tomorrow morning, which was not in the contract. Breck said nothing. He took the temporary billet the clerk offered, a room at the inn, town's expense, standard courier accommodation, and walked back out into the flat grey afternoon. He stood in the square for a moment. The boy from the cooperage step was still watching him from across the market. The 11 stalls had not become 30. A woman at the nearest one was packing her goods away with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to be gone before a certain hour. It wasn't his business. He had a room for the night and a document to collect in the morning and a road north waiting for him. Clean work. No complications. He looked at the bracelet on his satchel strap. Pale. Small. Saying nothing. He adjusted the strap across his chest, picked a direction, and started walking. Not toward the inn, toward whatever it was that had made this town so quiet.
If you have enjoyed this chapter, you can read the rest on Chad Rye's blog. There you will find many tales from Lumenvale, along with other stories, such as the one about a 7-foot-tall warrior who just wanted to live out the rest of his days in his keep in the southern woods, but is now the caretaker of a battered and beaten-down sun-elf who had been abandoned in the keep's dungeon. Or perhaps you like to know the tale of Aldarthok, the were-moose barbarian, who seeks to open his own tavern after a lifetime of fighting monsters, bandits, and his haunted past from the Century War. Or just maybe you would love a tale about a young man who rides a large red elk and saves a half-goblin woman whom he falls in love with, despite the world around him not wanting it to happen. Or, last but not the least, a lit RPG story about a young woman that is reincarnated into a fantastical world as an 8-foot-tall giantess. Whatever may be you fancy, you can find all of these stories on my blog or on Royal Road. I'll be sure to leave the links in the description. Thank you so much for listening to this chapter of Breck. More to come soon.